This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, setting the stage for a dynamic and open game. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a highly combative and imbalanced opening where black immediately challenges white's central pawn and seeks to create dynamic play on the queenside. This move initiates the closed Sicilian, a flexible system where white aims for a kingside attack, often after developing the bishop to b2 and a kingside pawn storm. This move, nc6, directly contests white's knight on c3, leading into a closed Sicilian or various other lines, and immediately prepares to challenge central pawn control. This move transitions the game into a variation of the Sicilian defense, often called the King's Indian attack setup for white, aiming for a fianchettoed bishop on g2 to control the long diagonal and a solid kingside structure. This move signals a transition into a King's Indian defense setup, preparing to fianchetto the bishop to control the long diagonal and potentially launch a kingside attack. This move fianchettos the bishop, aiming to control the long diagonal and prepare for kingside castling, aligning with white's intention to play a flexible system often seen against the Sicilian defense. Developing the bishop to g7 reinforces the fianchetto and prepares to castle kingside, a typical setup in the King's Indian attack variation of the Sicilian defense. This move develops the central pawn to control key squares and prepares to fianchetto the queen's bishop, solidifying a flexible pawn structure characteristic of some variations of the Sicilian defense. This move solidifies black's pawn center, preparing to develop the kingside pieces and potentially challenge white's d3 pawn. This aggressive pawn thrust seeks to control the center and potentially launch an attack on the kingside, reflecting the ambition of a Grand Prix attack structure within the Sicilian defense. This move solidifies black's central pawn structure, preparing to challenge white's ambitious kingside pawn push and potentially open lines for black's pieces. This move develops a knight to its natural square, supports the central pawn advance, and prepares for kingside castling while maintaining flexibility in the pawn structure. This developing move prepares to castle kingside and supports a potential central pawn break with d5, while also offering a flexible knight placement. This move prepares to develop the queen's bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting a kingside pawn advance or contributing to control of the d4 square. Castling kingside is a logical move, securing the king and activating the rook while developing a previously passive piece into the game. Castling on the kingside completes the development of the king's flank and connects the rooks, preparing to bring them into the game. This move aims to prepare for a kingside pawn advance or potentially shift the rook to a more active square on the queenside, creating counterplay against white's central pawn structure. This move initiates a pawn break in the center, aiming to destabilize black's pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces, particularly the bishop on g2 and the queen. This move, nf5, actively contests the central e4 pawn and prepares to challenge white's control of the d5 square, aiming to improve black's knight activity within the position. This move prepares to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, specifically g3 or h4, to pressure black's kingside while also reinforcing the central pawn structure. This move prepares to challenge white's central control by creating a pawn lever on the queenside, aiming to open the b-file for future piece activity. This pawn exchange opens the e-file, potentially leading to increased piece activity for white and creating a central pawn majority for black if they recapture with the d-pawn. This move recaptures the pawn, centralizing the queen and preparing to develop the rook to an open file, while also opening a diagonal for the queen that might be exploited later. This move centralizes the knight, increasing its influence and preparing to challenge black's kingside pawn structure. This move relocates the queen to a more active square, preparing to contest the c-file and potentially support a queenside pawn advance. This move reinforces the d4 square, preparing to expand on the queenside and potentially build a central pawn majority while supporting the knight's repositioning. Black develops the bishop to an active diagonal, eyeing white's queenside and preparing to challenge the advanced e5 pawn or support a future b5 advance. This move supports the potential advance of the c-pawn and aligns the queen with the open e-file, preparing to exert pressure on black's kingside. This move develops the rook to a more active central file, preparing to challenge white's control of the d-file and potentially support a queenside pawn advance. The move Rad1 centralizes the rook, preparing to challenge the d-file and potentially support a d5 pawn push, aiming for greater central control and piece activity. Black repositions the rook to a more active square, potentially supporting a pawn advance on the queenside or preparing to contest the d-file. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to support potential pawn advances or contest control of the central files. The move RBD8 centralizes the rook and prepares to challenge white's control of the d-file, potentially leading to an exchange that could open lines for black's pieces or support a pawn break. This pawn thrust challenges black's knight and aims to disrupt the opponent's kingside pawn structure while creating attacking opportunities. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to defend the kingside and potentially launch a counterattack. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to support the g4 pawn push and potentially exert pressure on black's queenside or center. This move sacrifices a bishop for 2 pawns and opens lines, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and activate black's pieces in the center. This move initiates a tactical sequence, forcing black to choose between recapturing the rook and defending the knight, with the goal of opening the d-file for the white rook. This capture on d3, while seemingly straightforward, initiates a complex tactical sequence. White aims to exploit the open d-file and centralize their queen, while black must carefully consider their response to avoid material loss or positional weaknesses. This aggressive pawn thrust exploits black's weakened kingside and aims to open lines for white's pieces, creating attacking chances against the exposed black king. This move, Knave5, is a strategic repositioning aiming to challenge white's central control and potentially create tactical opportunities by occupying an active square, while also preparing for future pawn advances. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's knight coordination and open lines for white's pieces towards the kingside. This knight sacrifice, while seemingly giving up material, aims to disrupt white's attacking pawn chain and gain crucial tempo to reorganize black's defenses. The recapture with the bishop on f3 is essential to maintain material balance and eliminate black's immediately dangerous knight, preventing further tactical complications and opening the position favorably for white's rooks. Black's queen retreats to d7 to avoid the discovered attack on the d-file and to maintain central influence while preparing to contest the open file with the rook. This pawn sacrifice exploits the pinned black queen on d7, aiming to open lines for white's rooks on the d-file and potentially create attacking chances against black's weakened kingside. The recapture of the pawn on e7 opens the f-file for white's rook and aims to disrupt black's king Safety. While black's queen now awkwardly occupies a central square vulnerable to attack. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control the long diagonal and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the kingside. Black repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially eyeing the c-file or preparing for future exchanges while keeping an eye on the d4 square. This pawn push aims to break open the kingside for attacking potential, forcing the black knight to retreat and potentially creating weaknesses around the black king. This move activates the rook, bringing it to the center of the board on an open file and contesting the d-file, aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and create counterplay. The king steps into a more active central role, clearing the g-file for potential pawn advances and preparing for piece coordination after the recent exchanges. The king's relocation to f8 aims to avoid the immediate threats of white's active pieces and potential checks, while also clearing the back rank for potential defense or maneuverability. The king repositions to a safer square, centralizing it for potential endgame play and avoiding the open lines created by the recent exchanges. This move decisively exchanges the last major piece for black, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit the open e-file for the white king, while also potentially creating attacking chances on the kingside with the remaining pieces. This move repositions the queen to the central files, aiming to control key squares, create potential mating threats, and prepare for further action in the newly opened territory after the pawn exchange and king reshuffling. This move aims to solidify the kingside pawn structure and provide a safe haven for the king, preparing for potential future pawn advances or defensive maneuvers. The move 30, b5 repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to contest the h2b8 diagonal and potentially support pawn breaks in the center or kingside. This exchange removes a key defender of black's king and opens up the g-file, simplifying the position in white's favor. This recapture on e5 regains material equality and centralizes the queen. But white now has a more active king after the exchanges. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially support a future pawn advance on the kingside. This move creates a weakness on the kingside by opening a line to the king and weakens the pawn structure. This move aims to secure the kingside pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances by advancing the g-pawn further, controlling vital squares. The move 3-3, qf4 repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to exert pressure on white's kingside and potentially coordinate with the g-pawn's advance. This move aims to recapture the pawn and prevent black from creating a dangerous passed pawn on the d-file, while also maintaining white's central control. This forcing check aims to disrupt white's king safety and potentially create tactical opportunities by forcing exchanges or king movement. The king is forced into a passive position, now vulnerable to perpetual checks or a loss of material if it doesn't find a safe square. This move repositions the rook to the first rank, challenging white's king and aiming to exploit the open d-file for potential mating threats or to force advantageous exchanges. This move is a tactical response to black's recent queen sacrifice, aiming to recover material by capturing the pawn and opening lines against the black king. This move aims to activate the f-pawn as an attacking piece, potentially disrupting white's king safety and creating tactical opportunities, though it also weakens black's kingside pawn structure. This move initiates a race against black's active queen, aiming to create a dangerous passed pawn while white's king is still exposed and black has Counterplay with the rook and queen. This move strategically aims to reinforce the center and prepare for a potential pawn advance on the king side, while simultaneously defending against white's passed pawn on h5. This move prepares to recapture the pawn on g4, aiming to eliminate white's attacking pawn and simplify the position. This forcing check aims to disrupt white's king and potentially win material or achieve a favorable endgame by exploiting the exposed white king. This move seeks to centralize the king to safety and prepare to defend the vulnerable passed pawn. On h6, the black queen check forces the white king to an exposed square, setting up potential mating threats and disrupting white's coordination after white's recent pawn push on the kingside. This move aims to defend the important e3 square, preventing further infiltration by black's queen and potentially allowing white to regroup and coordinate their pieces for a counterattack. This move, a capture of the e4 pawn, is forced after white's g4 pawn pushed up and attacked black's knight, and the subsequent queen sacrifice to deflect white's pawn. Black is aiming to disrupt white's king position, as the white king has been pushed from its castled safety.